So Dr. Ford is in the house and we are about to get started with our interview. So this is Serious Sunday with Nihanda and I'm interviewing Dr. Ford. Now, for those of you who don't know, I'm going to be reading a quick, very short, brief bio on some of the things that she's been involved with. So Dr. Ford is the director of the Mesoamerican Research Center at the University of California at Santa Barbara, as well as the president of the non-for-profit organization for exploring solutions past and present. That's ESP Maya. She's a distinguished Maya agriculture. Sorry, wow, I just got really nervous there. She is a distinguished Maya archaeologist whose research and publications have helped to decode the ancient Maya landscape. Her encounter of the ancient Maya city center of El Pilar, which I helped work on the contemporary divide of Belize and Guatemala, won acclaim with Rolex Awards for the enterprise and the promise to be the first cultural and natural peace park of the world. Her passion for the first cultural, I'm sorry. Dr. Ford, can you still hear me? It says that my
Yes.
internet is okay. Her passion for the common people of the ancient Maya, together with the contemporary international politics, conservation, and development, and the interdisciplinary research has inspired the vision of archaeology under the canopy, which is super cool from just going in, digging, displaying. In this engages the community in protected area management planning process that has been endorsed by the government of Belize and Guatemala, with nearly a half a decade of field experience and her broadly inquisitive mind. Dr. Ford sees the Maya forest as a garden carrying forward by the contemporary forest gardeners based on the legacy of the indigenous Maya. Her work is now internationally celebrated, brings to the fore the importance of understanding the past to envision creative solutions for the future. Dr. Ford, welcome.
Thank you.
Check out my hairstyle. Hello.
Wow,
It
that is
is.
that is amazing.
Thank you. So
What's
in light of
involved in
this,
preparing that?
oh, too much. I just take it and I twist them all into a little ball, but it's in light of this conversation of culture, um, I prepared a very cultural do.
Will it
um,
last a while?
well, depend on how I sleep.
Okay.
It should last me a few days. Yeah, it's pretty tight. Um, I've worked with you with archaeology under the canopy, and I know we have some um, questions prepared, but this is something that I thought was super cool. And so, can you start with that first, explaining how archaeology under the canopy is much different from just regular, what people
Well,
think of when they think of archaeology besides Indiana Jones?
yeah, the thing about understanding the past and appreciating the past is really understanding the environmental context and what has happened really, and I mean, it happened before Disney, but you can use the word
Hmm.
uh, uh, back in the times, for example, I think it was around the 20s, before 1930. Carnegie was
Okay.
working at Chichen Itza, and of course, there's this big pyramid there, and that wasn't the only place they were working. They had people looking at ethnobotany, at doing botanical surveys, language experts, agricultural people,
Hmm.
ethnographers. There was a fleet of people. Really must have been a really interesting time to be doing research. But of course, it was being funded by the Carnegie Institute of Washington. And
Oh,
Kidder, this guy, Alfred Kidder, was the head of that operation and was, the fui team, he really was on it. And but he wrote morally and said, and these are documents. I'm paraphrasing them, of course.
okay.
Uh, he wrote morally and said, like the board is a little concerned. Like we're on topic. We want to support the ethnobotany and
Hmm.
the ethnographies and all the things you're doing, the archaeology. But where's the beef? You know, we want to see something. He says, don't worry. You know, we're got that underhand. He's occupying the Hacienda Chichen, which is just outside of the major monuments. And he says, just hold on a minute. We'll get everything together and they come down and we'll have something to show them. And that's when he did the first work at the Castillo of Chichen Itza. And if you look at some of the drawings from and even photographs earlier than that, you will see that it doesn't look anything like that. There's environmental, you know, there's woods around, it's crumbled, you don't see
Mm-hmm.
the snake coming down. All of that, I think, is really, you know, the Disneyland of it. And it started with that. And then every other country that had a monument wanted to have their Castillo. So we have Tikal in Guatemala, and we have um, Caracol in Belize,
Right.
Copan in Honduras, and everyone has to have it. And the way it has to be is, whoosh, you know, cleared. And so you can see how many levels there are, you know, how tall it is. It has
Right.
a
Okay.
staircase. And we have to impose our imagination on that building. So it all of a sudden becomes our building. You know, it's not really reflecting anything of the past except the, you know, the core. There are actually conventions that say you should not use your imagination. You should leave to the imagination. But of course, these are conventions. They aren't, you know, treaties or laws. And so how people see leaving to the imagination is quite different in and so they really want to make it up because of course then you can really imagine it maybe, you know. But I feel that being honoring the environment that the Maya lived in and honoring the way the forest, as I say, is co-created. We may talk about that, but also how it has protected the monuments.
Okay.
And
So, right. So that maintaining a certain amount of protection around the sites by not removing too much is a part of the environmental protection of the site. For
right,
those
yeah,
who
it
are not
has
so familiar with how archaeology works, is when you take away too much, the
bare. It leave it bare.
it leaves it bare, and it destroys it, so to speak,
Well, it
or it's
exposes
more
it to the
vulnerable.
same degradation things that it went through when they stopped maintaining it. So if you think of your
Okay.
house and you don't maintain the roof, it'll fall down and create a mound of rubble, and then the forest will grow over that.
Okay.
Well, then whatever you find is what survived that. But if you then expose that to the sun and the rain and the exposures, you're creating the same environment that would, you know, degrade it. And what happens is that in this area, and I mean, probably all over the world, but we have limestone here, and limestone is very friable, fragile. And what
Mm,
happens is these biofilms that are the very, you know, they're life everywhere. They're on every surface you can look at. There are these things called biofilms. And
okay.
what happens with the biofilms that are go onto the exposed limestone, which of course is like the exposed monument, is they take up the salts that are exposed, that are coming from the sun and the rain and whatever, and then they're dropping acid, which is
Oh,
their
wow.
effluent, and the acid touches the rock and of course uh, turns it to dust. So if you can have the biofilms, their biofilms are going to be there, but if you have the biofilms that are used to sweet water, not salt water, then you will actually be, you know, reducing. I mean, obviously, if you expose something, you've got to think of how you're going to maintain it, but maintaining it under the canopy with shade, keeping the temperature very even, you know, keeping it
Hmm.
like it was before. And also, when it rains, it's not raining, it's not pouring, it's dispersed with the leaves and the branches. I mean, a lot of times I can show you pictures. A lot of times they put little awnings on it. Well, that just dries it out too. That is really not a good idea. It puts the water in all the bad places. What you want is water to be distributed like it was before we excavated. Now, excavation
Right,
is
naturally.
destruction. You know, you have to
Yeah.
realize that. But what we want is to, I mean, what the ideal is to create an environment that one you can appreciate and two will conserve the cultural as well as the natural.
So, so you're really an advocate for environmental awareness. I was doing a little bit of research on one of the authors that you said that you like to read when you have or
Mhm.
that you're interested in, and I just realized that I read this book from her, Barbara Kingsley,
Kingslaver, yeah. Hmm.
Kingslover, And the one I read was Poisonwood Bible. It was
Oh yes,
a
that is
while ago.
that's an excellent example of
Mhm.
ecological imperialism. You know,
Right.
it's where that person, the missionary in Africa,
Hmm.
wanted things, wanted to help things, but he only saw his way of helping,
Right.
and he
Yeah.
couldn't hear the people around him telling him, well, like the way he planted the plants. And
Hmm.
they said, no, you have to make humps because of the rain. No, 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 this is the way you do it. And of course, he lost everything.
Right, right. And this is really crazy because we had this conversation many times when you came here to visit in Germany,
Oh, yeah.
and we saw like the rows of just fields, agricultural fields,
Yeah.
and just these rows, and you were like, oh, that's not the way to do it. And I never thought about it because I've always seen that even back in Belize, you
Of
see
course, the
that's how
Mennonites.
agriculture is done. And I never thought that, yeah, when it grows wild in nature, there has to be a balance to it. And she talks a lot about that in her book, especially one that I just started to read like just now before we got on. I was getting really into it, called Unsheltered, because I realized, yeah, I kind of like her work because there's always
She's a
an
very edgy person. You know, did you read Bean Trees is the first one I read.
okay.
Uh, and it's quite different, but it's set in the American Southwest, which again is that environment that is
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah. But she also has a very she also tends to lean toward things like cultural sensitivity and being
Mhm.
able to involve people and looking at different perspectives of how things impact communities and how things
Yeah, she
impact
thinks of
the
things
environment.
holistically in a
And
way. Yeah. She has
yeah,
that A
yeah.
Year
And you
Without
tend
Meats. What I can't remember. She has a nonfiction where she made, oh no, local. She did everything local, and talks about how, what the problem is. Like if you go to Costco, it's not local, and to, but to
right.
for people who are more organic to sell to Costco, they have to have a scale, and so she gives you a lot of feeling for that. So she's really a great perspective. That Poisonwood Bible is a
It's
very good
wonderful. It's
example.
very
Hmm.
provocative, and I like in Unsheltered where she talks about this guy who he starts this community and he writes his own he writes his own articles, and he has this funny look and he has this weird hair, and he just basically forms this community. She's speaking about somebody very specific,
Hmm.
but no one would have predicted that such a president would actually be in existence because she doesn't make mention of any time
Oh yeah.
specifically. But I just thought that was like super clever.
Have
But
you read ever Margaret Atwood?
no, Margaret
She's,
Atwood.
well, she's the one that has become more recently important is The Handmaid's Tale.
Yes.
And but she's very, very clever as well. Um, a different kind of way, more social personality. She doesn't look at environment as much, although she's looking at your social environment.
Right, right.
Very, very, very
I've been
interesting.
okay. I've been told by several people that I should check her out. I'm gonna do that. But
Well,
um,
let me just tell you, I just to give you more meat to go on there. I went to hear her give a lecture. This is long ago. She was publishing the thing called Robber Bride at that time, and she also has a set of poetry, which is also really amazing. I'll see if
really,
I can remember. Yeah, about that same time that was. But and I'll go back to that. But at the end, she takes questions, and of course, I was at UCSB, and there were all these very, very, thoughtful young women who are, looking up to Margaret Atwood, who's been writing since the 50s, and you know, real obviously a strong feminist and
mhm.
all this stuff. And I mean, I'll only remember two of them, but they went in this ilk. So one young woman comes up to the mic and says, you know, what has really changed from the time you started writing and now? And she says, no problem, pantyhose. She says, when I first started writing, you could only have one, but now you can have two. So that, I mean, you can see that just flatten that person. And then
Yeah.
the next one was even more dramatic. She says, let's see if I can remember it. Oh, what about the options women have now? Because she's thinking there are more options now. She goes, oh yeah, there are a lot more. When I was growing up and looking for my life's mission, you could either be a wife have a career. Now you can't be a wife and no career too. So there's doubled. So I mean, I'm sure she knows those questions, but she's really worth reading. The poem I liked she read was called "The Little Red Hen Tells All," and you know how the little red hen has who's going to help me grow the wheat, who's going to help me grind the wheat, who's going to help me
Mm-hmm.
bake the bread, who's going to help me eat the bread. Of course, everyone wants to eat the bread but doesn't want to have
Oh,
any
that
part
was
with the
her?
other. That was no, that's not her. That's the little red hen story.
Okay.
That's the
This is a
fabled
story
story.
that
So
she
she
based this
has
on.
little red hen tells all. And she says, I'm
Ah,
tired of that. No more socialist thing. It doesn't really matter, It's a great poem saying,
okay.
I've had it. People have to contribute or I'm not going to give them the bread. That's it, period.
Wow, that's great. So you say
That's a
that
whole different side. You asked me ones I took. I mean,
I did, and we went down that hole, but that's fine because you gave me a
mhm,
lot to look up and research and read, so I'm
mhm.
excited about that. But so if you believe in equity, how is that then? You said one of your two core beliefs are honesty and equity. How is well, honesty is given. Well, these days you can never
Maybe.
know,
Yeah,
but
right. Yeah, we try.
maybe we don't know. But also equity. How do you see equity being different from equality? Just to be provocative.
Okay, yeah, I think equality is. I hadn't thought of it that way, but let me say what I think about equity. Equity means that when you're interacting with people, you take them. If they're the King of France or the you know street person in Santa Barbara, you treat them the same until you have a reason not to. You treat
Okay.
everyone equitably. You take people in that honest way. You count them uh, count them 100% until they degrade themselves. I guess I don't
Right,
know what to
right.
say. Like so. I mean, my experience, for example, in Belize is that the authorities do not treat people equitably. And by that,
Okay.
I mean, it's not equality. It's that they treat them, okay, those are peasants. They don't know anything. And some people definitely don't know anything, but other people know a whole lot. And in
Mm-hmm.
Spanish, there's this word education, educado, or educated, but it doesn't mean, you have a PhD. It means you have a cultural standing. So you treat people equitably. So when you meet someone, you are kind to them, that
Mm-hmm.
if you're in a position to be a host, you treat them as a host would do. But what happened was that when I started doing really starting working at the house and forest garden, and I really wanted to make that place called Sunun, where I have a ancient Maya house, and I want to create it as a forest garden. And I realized I really needed to get people who knew the forest garden. I started collecting them again, asking them if they would help and come up. And the stories about that, the troubles I had were somewhat dramatic, so that my field director did not want to have Narciso on the project. But I said, we have to
Okay.
have him. So I see, so he is just so engaging, lovable, equitable, all those things. I mean, he has a kindness that is very, very deep.
Mm-hmm.
And so he goes out with a team, and at lunch, he pulls out 2 pineapples and cuts them up for everyone. Now, Clark, who was, we wanted to defend me, he didn't want anyone to hurt me. He was, out there being my field director, came back, he says, "Oh, Narciso," Can you imagine? So that's the kind of I guess in equity, I want kindness to be forward, and equality doesn't mean kindness. I think equity means kindness.
Okay.
So
Okay.
like if like anyone you meet has is equally able to be your friend, or collaborate or express themselves, or be themselves, and you won't say, oh well, because they don't have a PhD, I'm not going to listen to them.
Right, right. That's deep. That actually speaks a lot to the kind of work that you had to do getting people in the communities involved in the on the ground maintenance and management of, for example, El Pilar. Do
Yeah.
you think that that was something that you've had to that you experienced that as one of the challenges, and what are some of the challenges that you've experienced working in your field?
Hmm. I think that the ordinary archaeologist would not need to engage, or you would minimally engage with the community. I remember a colleague of
Mhm.
mine in Guatemala, I was saying I was going to be giving a lecture, and I apparently mentioned that would be in Spanish. She says, well, I'm not going to give it a lecture. I'll give it in English. I mean, I don't speak perfect Spanish, but I'm going to make my effort because I'm in a place that speaks Spanish. And I felt that that was, not engaging with the community. I mean, that's a minimal thing you could say, but I think that so just to set the scene, the kinds of things I asked were things that just weren't ever asked. I mean, I set up in 1992. I knew I was finishing my a phase where I was excavating all the house mounds. Not all of them, but I mapped house mounds, and then I wanted to do these full scale excavations that I did in 91, 92, and 90, 91, 92. And so I asked the community in Bullet Tree, which I felt all they had to do was put up a sleeping policeman and they have everyone, right? You could going up to Pilar. And I wanted to talk to them about that, how they had this opportunity if I was going to be working up there, that this is something that will change the landscape. Well, changed a lot of different things, but I gave them a heads up, you could say, and I don't think that's always what is done. And then, of course, I wanted to follow up with that. By 95, I was talking about, the park. I think in 95, yeah, that was when they were putting in the boundaries. And that was sort of, that was me helping Lands and Survey. And we even had some of the people who were more involved from the village did a survey. I mean, can you imagine? They didn't want to do the survey, but I suggested they did. And then they found out that, at that time anyway, which I think was about 97, that people were either indifferent or interested, and that no one was really negative. And they got a feeling that, maybe this idea isn't so bad. But I had them help me. I mean, they do that. You can't, I mean, they were with me. I helped them inventory it so we could say something about that. I don't know. I think that I've just been very interested in how change happens. I would have loved to have like a physical anthropologist measuring children's height, and weight or something as a something that is just not, something that's a sidebar that isn't necessarily linked to whatever changes are happening in the village, so but I don't have those kinds of things, but
That
maybe
would have been
someplace.
actually pretty interesting to see, actually. But you said that's something that's just not done. Do you find that there's a certain level of diplomacy that comes along with going into communities and engaging?
I don't know
How
if
do
I'm
you?
dip I the one thing I'm not is very diplomatic. I'm really that's I don't mean not diplomatic. I mean, I don't have those ethnographic skills and social skills in the village. Like I can remember like asking questions, and some questions you don't get the answer for a year, you know.
Hmm.
You don't, it's not like the pedagogy, like I ask my
Yeah,
students, how many, looters trenches are there at El Pilar, and they give me the answer,
right.
Uh, no, these some are, and I guess I'm asking thoughtful or deeper questions that I don't really know are, or questions that they haven't had to consider. Then there's the other things that community, at least my experience, the community isn't a community. There's a lot of different views, and some people
Hmm.
just want to do the work. Just tell us what has to be done, and we want to do it. And other people want to talk forever on what should be done.
Oh yeah, I know
Yeah,
all about
so you know what I mean.
that. Yeah.
Um,
Okay, well, then what are some of the things that you are the most passionate about these days?
well, I've always been impassioned by the environment and understanding the environment, and and how humans use it. And of
Mm,
course, so then conservation and development. We can't get away from development, but I would like development to take a pattern or a path that would be considering conservation. That's why archaeology under the canopy is so important. It will set a new view of how we engage with monuments. So it's not that it has to always be under a canopy. What if it's in a desert? Well, it just has to be engaged with the environment. There's a beautiful site. I don't know how it looks now. It's in Oaxaca. It's called Yagul. And when I go there, when I've been there, haven't been to Oaxaca in certainly a decade, but uh, people are having picnics and whatever. And this is a pretty arid environment. So there's cactus and other things around. But you go up to Monte Alban and it looks like, Chichen Itza, everything is clean, clear. It's soulless, it doesn't have a soul. And that the setting had to do something, I mean, well, the one thing you can do when you go up to Monte Alban is you see the view. And I guess they wanted to make sure you saw the view, but that's it. You see the clean monuments. I mean, and absolutely clean plazas. There's not a speck, maybe if there's a speck, they'll bring in the weed whacker or the mower or something like that. My bane, I don't want to see those things.
Yeah, so if you could meet, we asked that one already. So you said that you like to visit museums and monuments when you have free time. Um, what
If
are
I
some of the
travel, I'm
you travel?
a permanent
Really?
when I anywhere I go, I want to see museums. Like what's the name of the town you were in? And we walked all around. The walls were
Oh, in
gold,
Weilerstadt.
and
So guys, when I first moved to Germany, I lived in Weilerstadt, which is a very small town, and it is home and birth of Kepler. He's a
yeah,
mathematician, astrologer, and they have a big
not
monument.
astrologer, astronomer.
Astronomer, thank you. Yeah, he's an astronomer. And but the village is pretty much still has its town wall intact. And
Yeah,
Dr. Ford had me walking in the rain, German rain, the whole day to look at them.
but it was
And
beautiful.
it was. I have to admit, it was quite
And
an
and and
experience.
and your house and my where you put me
Right
up
by the
was
church.
inside.
Yeah, it's
I
inside the
mean,
city walls.
that
Yes.
is just that was to me that was exciting.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
didn't imagine that I would be able to stay in something like that. And Kepler, oh my gosh. The
I
only
thought
thing is
that's.
we had to eat breakfast outside the walls.
Oh, we couldn't find a place inside? No,
No, we
everything
had
closed.
it was a nice place we went. It
Yeah,
was a
but I think
bakery kind
everything
of thing.
doesn't open. Yeah, the bakery
Yeah.
there, they weren't
Anyway,
open then.
those are the kinds of things that really, really thrill me. You say like I was in Berlin. I don't know if you've been to Berlin, but there's the
No.
Museum and there's this thing called the Pergamon.
Okay.
And what the Germans did, and this is, when they made friends with the Ottoman Empire, they built the railway. I'm probably simplifying it, but
Hmm.
they literally took piece by piece the Pergamon. The It's one to one. You walk in. It's not called the Pergamon just, like as they like the Roman monuments or the what ancient monument. No, you walk in and that's what you see, the Pergamon. I went there to see the Ishtar Gate. They took the Ishtar Gate from Babylon
Wow.
and reassembled it there. So I don't know what other things they have there, but those are two they have. And
Wow. I did not know that.
so I
Oh,
mean,
now I have to
it's
go.
pretty. I mean, that's the only place you can see the Ishtar Gate of Babylon is in
Wow.
Berlin.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So, I mean, and then what that means is not just you're seeing the Ishtar Gate. You have to imagine what was the condition that allowed those beautiful. I mean, what's left in Babylon had none of those surfaces. It's a beautiful surface. It's glazed bricks, and has lions and funny other animals all over it, and
Okay.
it's beautiful. But
I bet.
it's not in Iraq. Well, maybe it's a saving grace now because it might have been blown up. I don't know, but I mean, Babylon is an important place, but you cannot
Yeah.
see the original things in Babylon. God knows what you can see now. But anyway, and I mean, that's really when I was 4 years old. I lived in Rome. I went to the Forum, and when I was 14, I saw Babylon, and then when I was uh, 20, I saw uh, Tikal, and all of those are civilizations, really different contexts. And I think that's another thing that's where environment plays. There's similar stories in those three examples,
Okay.
but the environment was different. The trajectory, the timeline, and what's happening today there is different.
Okay. With Babylon, what else did you say?
Forum, Rome,
Babylon, Rome, and
Tikal.
how would you say Babylon and Tikal differ? I'm not too familiar with Babylon. Well, it's more
Well, it's
desert,
desert.
isn't it?
Yeah, it's more desert there. You don't
Now.
see big trees. Yeah, and it probably was pretty arid at the time that they were living there. But arid with the water, water. They were. It's themed as an irrigation civilization. But
Hmm.
the It's how they related to their environment and the story of complexity. I mean, it's sort of what I mean, you were talking about equity. I think complex societies tend to be inequitable.
Mm,
That when you have a hierarchy, instantly there's power structures that are not familial. So before you had something like Babylon or Tikal, we had societies where essentially you achieve status. So elders and qualities that you had,
okay.
if you had if you were medicinally smart or whatever, you achieve status. And then the difference between that, I mean, it's obviously something that's more of a continuum, but places like Tikal and Rome and Babylon had hierarchies. And my question really is how are these hierarchical societies, how are they organizing their subsistence sector, and what are the people who are producing, because they're not the same people that
What kind of
are
people they're
managing.
producing? Yeah,
What I mean, so I think I might have mentioned James Scott in the people that I was interested in.
right.
He's an
I was gonna ask you
agricultural,
about that. Yeah.
yeah, he's an agricultural historian, and he
Oh,
wrote a book called uh, The Moral Economy of the Peasant. And it's a very interesting. I mean, I feel like, I guess if you talk about someone I'd want to meet, I have corresponded with him. I haven't met him, but
okay.
he has a very distinct way of looking at um, Southeast Asian agrarian history. And so that one, seeing like the one that was The Moral Economy of the Peasant, essentially is saying that producers of the subsistence sector, which would be called peasants, are fine with giving you whatever you want as long as their family's healthy. At the moment, there is a bridge of that, like that's when they become more rebellious, we'll say.
Oh,
And
wow.
so they're not they I mean, and then this gets into the anthropology section. What is surplus? Because the
Mhm.
impression you have in the development of complexity is that the system is pulling out the surplus, is forcing people to produce more so that they don't have to work. I mean, that would be what, but where
The
they work
system
at the.
is pulling out surplus so that people on the hierarchy don't have to work as hard as everyone else. You mean?
Well, that's sort of saying it differently. I would like to imagine that the people who are managing things actually do work as well.
Right.
So as population's growing, the relinquishment, the change from what I called achieve status to ascribed status is largely because you need adjudicators, you need educators, you need managers. And what those people have to do, like if they're adjudicating, you have a dispute between two farmers about something, he has to or she has to be a person, that individual has to be a person that knows and believes and people have faith in that they can adjudicate. But if they're out
Right.
there farming and then they're also adjudicating, that's going to be hard for them to do that, let's just say full time. I would like to imagine, maybe I'm this sort of I don't want to say I'm a Pollyanna about it, but maybe the idea is that the relinquishment of that power is really in favor of, let's just say, peace, because they're going to be managing local disputes as well as
Right.
external disputes, and making sure, you wouldn't have a person like Kepler, I mean, those people couldn't go and look at the sky if they had to also I mean, they know things. I mean, everybody knows something about the moon, for example, or the sun. But I
Hmm.
mean, you can imagine. I think it's complicated, and I guess I'm taking a bit of us. I imagine the start wasn't so pernicious as where we are now. But he has this other one, and I don't know if you've read anything about Rome, but this is Southeast Asia. It's called Seeing Like a State. And
Seeing like a state?
yeah, Seeing Like a
Okay.
State. And that is another one that is really interesting because I mean, it reminds me of the Roman Empire too, because in those systems, they think everyone wants to be a Roman citizen, or everyone wants to be this thing that we are, bringing in, gold, or I don't know what, having money. I mean, that's
Hmm.
another thing you have to adjudicate,
Right.
create,
Right.
making sure there's land, respect and so forth, seeing like a state, stop seeing like what is not a state. And then by doing that book, he wrote another one called The Art of Not Being Governed. And everyone is like all
Mm,
about the Maya collapse. And somehow in those three books, I see the answer, and I am still thinking about it, the answer to what is the Maya collapse. Because the Maya collapse is not as people want to see it. You know, it's um, just basically argued that that it was overpopulation and destruction
right.
of the landscape.
Uh-huh.
I don't believe that at all, for two reasons. One, the forest is there. It's not, if it was destroyed, it would not be there. And the dominant plants of the Maya forest are all useful. So those to me are a key. They kind of make me wake up and like, how did that happen? And so
Hmm.
then I look to the traditional farmers and find people who are, I mean, not everyone. There are a lot of farmers, and not every farmer, is perceiving the landscape in the same way. But
Exactly.
they
But you
certainly
mean
are
in the
look.
Mayan community,
Yeah, well, these
right?
communities adjacent to. I mean, I
Hmm.
started reading about traditional farming, so I knew that there had to be traditional farmers.
Hmm.
And we had known
Hmm.
Narciso Torres for a long time and seen his place, and that struck me. But I hadn't really spent a lot of time. But 1995, I started bringing people who knew about the forest and the garden up to El Pilar and started looking at it. And I mean, really great examples. Like I wanted to plant cacao up there because cacao is an important plant.
Hmm.
Aaron, who was a forest gardener, said it's not going to grow. So but let's just
Yeah.
put it in anyway. Well, it didn't grow because it wants deep acid soils, and those are the
In the
soils that are
south,
good.
right?
Yeah, well, that's where they need places like the valley. They need deep
Mm,
soil. So
okay.
like Belize Valley is perfect too. So
Okay.
like I have cacao growing in my at Brass Base, and it grows fine, you know. That's deep soils that are a lot of water and acidity. But
Okay.
try to grow chaya there, you have to put lime on it to make sure it keeps growing well. I mean, it grows, but it doesn't like it. Where it grows just fine at El Pilar, like maize will grow fine at El Pilar, where it won't like, I mean, not that it doesn't grow there, but you have to have a lot better drainage and think about the amendments you need.
Right.
The
So
reason why
what
El
does he?
Pilar's up there is because that's where the dominant food was, and that's where the biggest population was.
Okay, then that would make sense. What
I mean,
if
you
he
don't eat
gets?
cacao. I mean, it's not going to give you the full sustenance. It might make you give you a little buzz, but it's not going to.
It's not going to be like the real thing. So what does
Yeah.
he say is the answer? Like, what
Oh,
does he say
oh, okay.
happens?
He doesn't. Okay. Get back. Yeah, right. I
I'm
leave
being
you
lazy,
hanging
you,
there
but
a little
I'm
bit.
probably looking at it myself.
No, it's very interesting. Plus, the way he writes, he uses the word she instead of he quite often. So it
Mm,
wakes you
okay.
up too in that way. His earlier stuff isn't that way, but the art of not being governed is. But what's interesting about this art of not being governed and seeing like a state, you have to imagine the state. I mean, I'm looking around here. We have these terrible homeless situation. It's
Mm-hmm.
because we have a lot of land ownership. And before, land ownership was more, even though all land was owned, there was just a lot more open space and not as confined. And
Mm-hmm.
not, people weren't saying you're trespassing.
Mm-hmm.
uh, but anyway, that's the state closing in on space, you could say.
Mm-hmm.
And um, and there's always people that don't want to be controlled by the state. There's always somebody that wants to be not part of that, the art of not being governed. And in this case, he's looking at the state. I can't remember whether it's in Cambodia or Thailand. It might have been Thailand. It could be Vietnam, but all those areas are in paddy farming. And
Okay.
to do that, you have to have organizations that keep the bunds, the things that keep the water in, that control when the water comes and goes. I mean, access to water and so forth. And the plants are ones dry. There's not a lot of production, you could say, in dry rice, and it doesn't produce very well without a lot of attention anyway. So 500 years ago, there was the Great Columbian Exchange, and plants that were from everywhere. So like if you look at a forest garden in in Belize or Guatemala or Mexico now, you'll see oranges, and they're from China, and you'll see mango from South Asia. You'll
Hmm.
see almond tree, which is actually from Southeast Asia.
Right.
You'll see banana from the ocean ones, coconut. I mean, can you imagine? I can't even imagine something without a mango and orange, you know, or some kind of citrus. Those are just always there. So those are things that happened in this great Columbian exchange. But
Okay.
things went from from the New World to other places as well. It wasn't just a one-way street. And it's sometimes hard for me to think about it. I'm always thinking of the ones that came. But in Southeast Asia, the introduction of maize and manioc was a revolution because maize and manioc do not need paddy farming. And they are very tolerant of elevation, of differential rainfall, and in some cases can be, well, most cases can do not require the kind of intensive industry that paddy farming does. And so people left. They left. The state couldn't believe it. You know,
Wow.
how could they leave? Why don't they want to be citizens? We're the greatest thing in the world. And they escaped. And they're escape
Wow.
agriculturalists, and they planted manioc and maize, among other things, obviously. But those things don't require the kind of attention that
Wow.
paddy farming. And
That is
if you think, then
wild.
overlay that in the Maya area and think, I mean, seeing like a state and the moral economy of the peasant, start thinking about those things and thinking about the late classic, which is this exuberant time period of huge amount of construction and building and
Hmm.
lots of differentiation in the residential sector, which has been my career, is mapping house mounts.
Hmm.
And so these residential units, we have small ones and large ones. We have groups and individual ones. I mean, this is, and 95% of them date to the late classic. Um, and then the terminal classic is a period that is attenuated, sort of disappearing. And then we don't have, I mean, the kind of work I do not find the post classic, because the post classic people did not have to keep up with the Joneses. They didn't have to have fancy buildings. They just had to use the forest as a garden. And it was still there. That was so the thing is that we see the absence um, of land use indicators as a situation of, you know, that they didn't do a good job or something. And we also see the forest not as a garden. I mean, the traditional way is, and we also see the seasons as wet and dry, when really it's two wet seasons and one
Hmm.
dry season. So we
Okay.
have the hurricane warm, and we have the north stuff coming from the from Southeast Asia. I mean, Southeast from Southeast United States, bringing the cold weather down. Uh, so you know, it's a very more complex and more nuanced, and I don't think there was ever a time it wasn't productive.
Right. So there's just been like a cycle, a movement.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and also think about Constantinople was the new was one of the changes when Rome was not doing well, that went moved to
Right.
Constantinople, and then Aachen. Have you been to Aachen? That's
No, I
near
have
you.
not.
And that was the Holy Roman Empire. And then so think about the distance between Tikal, for example, and Merida or Chichen. It's really, that's less. So, and at the time of conquest, there's this wonderful book called the art of no, the art of not the conquest of the last Maya kingdom, and you see what the Maya had. Correo had runners, and something would happen in the north, and within a day or two, they knew about it in Flores. So, you know, the idea that there wasn't communication and that something they stopped maintaining, and really the collapse is simply not maintaining those big
Hmm.
architectural things. And think about Belize, think about Guatemala, think about Mexico. I gave a talk in Campeche one time, and I'll say this was 10 or 15 years ago, and it was the rainy season. It was raining and raining and raining. And their big university auditorium, they had buckets collecting water. And so that's big infrastructure. They're using, and they're using it at the same time, the roof is terribly leaking. So, you know, what is maintenance? What is abandonment? I was in India. I was in Shibpur, which is across from Calcutta, and I went to a botanic garden. I suspect that would surprise you. Instantly, I'm seeing, oh, look, this is mahogany. I was looking at all the plants,
Wow.
uh, but and so that was a garden set up by the Great Britain to show off things. But there was interesting because that was, I think, was established, I'll say, in 1880s. There were old buildings that were abandoned. There were old buildings that still had people working in it. There were new buildings that people were still working in. And this was all happening in Shibpur, which outside, they were the pop-up temples of Kali, because I was there, in Diwali. I mean, this is a big example of how not maintenance doesn't mean abandonment. And
I
that's
really, I feel that, yeah, we come back to this German conversation, German architecture and monuments as well, because they just passed a maintenance act in the whole of Europe, I think, where they're starting to encourage people to buy up these old buildings that have been abandoned, because a lot of the young people have moved out of small villages like in Spain and Italy to go to
mhm.
different parts of Europe where they can find work. So you could get these deals, they call them, where you could buy a home for a dollar,
But you
but you
have to
have to
maintain it.
commit. Yeah, you have
Mhm.
to commit to like maybe 10,000 or $3,000 over a year, not dollars, euros of
But
maintenance,
still,
and
but still, just getting those things up to speed is going to be a
it's gonna
challenge.
be, yeah,
Yeah,
it's
I've
quite
wa
impressive.
yeah,
We
early on, I visit in the days when before March 2020. Every year I would go to Ireland,
mm,
and I've been to Ireland and since then. But when I go, I have a pilgrimage to the house that my grandmother was born in, and it still had a roof when I first went. Now the roof has fallen down, and beautiful pieces of wood. I just can't imagine not wanting to have. But of course, if you bought it, it would be a heritage item, and then no plumbing. How would you bring that into, a usable
that would
fashion?
be a project. That would
It
definitely
would
be
be
a
a
project.
project. It would be a
Um,
project.
Dr. Ford, it's been great having you. We are now 5 minutes over time, but I really want
Oof.
to ask just one last question before we go. We didn't get to touch on everything, but I do want to ask, how has your field changed over the time that you've been in anthropology, archaeology, and advocacy of,
Well, that's of course a big question. I think
you
that
know,
the one one
one
one
minute.
aspect is the presence of women that I think are more prevalent, and it's more accommodating that they're couples that are hired.
Okay.
When I had my degree, they just didn't want even consider hiring more than one person in a job where it was very hard. So that's an old story for me. And then I
Mm,
think one of the things that we just touched on before is that there is more interest in how archaeologists are interacting with the community, a recognition, if not, really bringing it to the fore, that it's part of the sort of the colonial process, and that we should be including, as they say, different narratives, so that
right.
Alfonso Sul would have a different way of looking at things than I do. But what's been nice in my experience is that by combining these, we get a new story that is collective.
Wow, that's great. Thank you so much for being on the show with us, guys. Tonight we have had Dr. Annabelle Ford, um, women who make things happen. So thank you for joining us, and I will be sending this off